On behalf of the Clark County and Columbia chapters of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, I'm welcoming you. Our moderator for the program, we are very blessed, Stephen K. Green. Stephen is an attorney, and he was the former legal director of AU. Now he's in Oregon. He's the director of the Center for the Study of Religion, Law, and Democracy at Willamette University School of Law. So we're very fortunate to have Stephen here, and he's going to run the program.
When the Americans United chapters started planning this event, and then they talked to me about moderating, I said, sure, this is always an important and timely issue. I don't know if they had the crystal balls out and I didn't, or you just don't ever trust what a law professor tells you about what trends are coming down the line. But this has just turned into be an amazing matter of coincidence, if you want to call it that, or to a certain extent, maybe that is evidence of exactly where things are going. In that, in the time within which the AU chapters first started discussing this event and today, we have actually seen a phenomenal, whatever you want to call it, groundswell, or at least a movement that has existed within the legal community just recently on the issue of gay marriage. I mean, this really is remarkable. We all knew about Prop 8 in California, and then we knew what would happen as a result of that. But of course, that case, now, a new case has been filed now in the California Supreme Court on this issue. I'll be happy to talk about kind of what the legal rationale is going to be on that when that comes up, or it's already been argued, although Beth may probably knows more about that than I may about that. But then, who would have thought Iowa? What's wrong with Iowa? You would have a unanimous decision, and actually a very, very well-written unanimous decision by the Iowa Supreme Court, finding that to deny individuals the ability to get married on the basis of sexual orientation is a violation of constitutional principles of equal protection, of equality. Then you have the Vermont legislature. Even though Vermont was one of the first states to come forward with a civil union type statute, the Vermont legislature realizing after time saying, this is still not adequate, this is still not enough. And so the Vermont legislature enacting a law, veto-proof law over the governor to bring Vermont into the fold, along with Massachusetts and Connecticut. And I think we're going to be seeing several other states in New England coming through. And just this last week, the governor of New York held a press conference and talked about how he is going to be, or has introduced, a piece of legislation to allow for gay marriage in New York. So this was a great timing. I mean, I commend whoever really came up with this particular day able to do this. So hopefully we will all learn something from today, and we'll kind of have an understanding of why this is an important issue, why this is an important human rights issue, why this is an important issue for equality, and why this is a church-state issue, which I'll be talking about a little bit after we have our panelists make their presentations. So anyway, welcome. I appreciate you coming here. And we will proceed with several of the panelists and then some personal statements. And then, as Susan said, we will then have question and answers. And we do request when you do the questions, please use the microphone because you are being recorded, so we will know who you are and we can track you down. See, if I'd said that back in the last administration, it would not have been a joke. You would not have laughed. But fortunately, in this administration, we can all laugh about that, and hopefully that is long in the past. Okay. Well, our first panelist is Tamara Meltz. She's a professor of political science at Reed College, and she'll be talking about the history and some of the background for marriage just generally in America, so you kind of get an understanding of exactly what this institution is.
This is my first opportunity in Oregon to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing for the last, what seems like forever, but isn't forever. And I think it's an important issue, so thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. So I was asked to talk about the changing definition of marriage And I wanted to start out by saying that this request is either, you're either asking me to do something that's impossible or that is political. And if you're looking for a single definition of marriage, then the task is impossible. Because human existence doesn't come with a dictionary, an authoritative, universally agreed upon dictionary of terms. And then as a matter of fact, across time and place, human beings have arranged our sexual, social, intimate, reproductive lives in ways that is impossible to capture in a single definition. So scholars have largely agreed that it would be impossible to come up with a universal definition of marriage that captured, marriage across time and place. What that means is that defining marriage is unavoidably political. And by political, I mean that human choice is involved in, human choice about inclusion and exclusion is always captured by any definition that we use. So another way to put that is that marriage is whatever whoever we is, say it is. So with that, I should say, obviously, with this claim, I'm disagreeing with people, or I'm challenging those who believe that we have a universal extra-human source of meaning, whether it's God or nature or reason, and I'm disagreeing in an agnostic way. I'm saying for politics, in a liberal democratic society such as ours, we need to leave that aside. Anyway, I'm going to avoid that dispute, and I'm just going to give you some sense of the myriad features that scholars have identified as the core of marriage, and how those features have either changed over time or how they're very different across different cultures. And I thought I'd start with a very popular, in one sense of the word, definition of marriage these days, which you may, if you've been following the debates, have heard, which is that marriage is, quote, a union between one man and one woman. Now, you could call this the DOMA definition, right? The Defense of Marriage Act that was enacted in 1996 under the Clinton administration. And I'm going to call it the DOMA definition because it's a definition that was then, that has been sort of enshrined in a number of state constitutions and legal systems since then. So my claim is that the DOMA definition of marriage is an historically peculiar definition. And so how is it peculiar? Well, let's start with the first part of it, which says that that marriage is between two people. Most scholars agree on this, if nothing else, that polygamy, not monogamy, is the norm if we take human history as our subject. Now, I am no Bible scholar, and we have people who know the Bible much better than I do, but I teach in a humanities course, and we just finished teaching the Hebrew and Christian Bibles, and I can just tell you that the Bible is replete with stories of monogamous marriages, and Jacob with his 4 wives is a nice example of that. But the Judeo-Christian traditions are hardly the only ones where polygamy is present. So it's contemporary Islamic cultures, ancient Egyptian and Persian cultures are just some examples of cultures that conscience multiple marriages or marriages with multiple people. So then the second feature of the DOMA definition of marriage is what I call the isolated couple, right? That there are two people, that's what it consists of. Now, most scholars have argued that the companionate marriage that is popular in contemporary imagination and law, which really focuses on two individuals in love, alone, who've come together for a common life purpose, that this is both new and radical in sort of historical terms. So historian Lawrence Stone identifies the beginnings of this view in the Anglo-American tradition in the 17th century and its first full fruition in the 19th century. So again, the norm across time and place is that the defining feature of marriage, on this count at least, is that it functions as the basis of political ties among families or clans, right? So marriage is hardly concerned with the individual couple within it, at least historically and cross-culturally that's been true. Third, there's this business of man and woman, right? That's the much disputed question of gender, and as an historical matter, has the heterosexual couple or heterosexual sex been at the center, the core of any most formally sanctioned public institutions of intimate union? Yes, probably historically that has been the norm. But we know, and I just got the time signal, so I'm not going to go on, but we know that there are many examples, and there's at least a vibrant debate among scholars about whether ancient Roman law recognized marriage between men. Okay, here's the thing I think that is most peculiar about the DOMA definition. It's really what is missing from the definition. I mean, think about the definition. Marriage is a union between a man and a woman. It's a very thin or sort of empty definition. Now, it makes a lot of sense in a liberal democracy that the legal definition of the institution should be so thin, but it is peculiar, and I think it has importance. The fact that it's so thin or sort of empty is worth thinking about, both in terms of what it does for the institution of marriage, however it's conceived in our society. But also, I think it leaves out this fact. This is something that the DOMA definition doesn't say, but is very much sort of enacted by the definition, which is the role of the state in marriage. And again, as an historical matter, the state has not always been the primary definer, conferrer, and regulator of marriage. There was a sort of one scholar, one historian of marriage, Nancy Cott, describes it as a 300-year battle. And here she's talking about, again, in the Anglo-American tradition, a 300-year battle between the church and the emerging state, sometime in the 15th to the 18th century. And it was really a battle that was the conclusion. We're living with the conclusion today, which is that the state is very involved in defining, conferring, and regulating marriage, but it has not always been the case. And of course, we know, both from our own society, people who marry without legal sanction and yet still marry, right? We've got churches and synagogues, et cetera, that recognize marriage, but also people who live on the outskirts, as it were, of society. So my sister lives in Ecuador and works with tribes in the Amazon. They marry and they do something that looks like marriage, what they call marriage, and it's not sanctioned by the state. So I think one of the things that often gets missed in this debate is the peculiar role that the state has in what we call marriage. So I could go on, but I was given the 2-minute warning, so I'm just going to say this, that there are many other sort of vectors on which scholars have used to define marriage. They've said children are the core of marriage, sex is the core of marriage, economics, property, all these things. Regardless, whichever one of these vectors scholars choose, I can tell you that there's a diversity across time and place. So what this does, it raises the point that as a matter of history, or it demonstrates the point as a matter of history, the DOMA definition of marriage is peculiar. And I think once we recognize that it's a peculiar definition in all these ways, it then sort of begs a bunch of questions, which I think of as political questions, which I think you guys are all asking, but about what are the political economic functions of the reigning definitions, who's doing the defining, why are they doing the defining, what are the costs and benefits of those definitions, and then what are the interests and values that they aim to promote or demote.
Thank you, Professor Noakes. This is actually not my area of legal history that I study most of the time, but actually I do think that one of the things that I've heard, or at least seen reference, is one of the reasons the states first started getting involved in regulating marriage and taking away the jurisdiction or the authority from the church was not so much marriage qua marriage as it was they wanted to stabilize concerns about inheritance, that was one of the main reasons. It's a property rights origin of the states becoming involved primarily in marriage. It wasn't to regulate all these other things. And so I want to make sure that the bastard kid didn't end up getting the money or whatever. I mean, that was that type of interest involved. And that was really only back, 400 years ago, the state started doing that. And so it's just some of the things I think we kind of tend to forget in the ongoing debate we have today about this. It's really interesting. All right. Well, thanks so much. The second panelist is Beth Allen, who's an attorney here locally, and actually I got to know her 5 years ago. Is that when Measure 36?
Oh gosh.
Gosh, seems like a lifetime ago. But anyway,
A long time ago.
long time ago, working with Basic Rights Oregon on the proposition here in Oregon, which unfortunately passed. But anyway, she'll be talking about some of the legal implications, or at least some of the things that individuals face as a result of not having the marriage right.
I did change my PowerPoint a little bit, and I'm going to deviate from it a little bit. And after I thought about it for a while, I decided to change the title, and I changed it to "It Ain't Marriage." But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about what Oregon and Washington's domestic partnership law is, and then a little bit of what it isn't. The things that I'm going to note for you are the things that are a little bit different. You have to be at least 18 years old. This is Oregon. If you are familiar with Oregon marriage law, you only have to be 17, but you have to be 18 to DP. And I say DP. When I say DP, I'm talking about capital D, capital P, registered domestic partner, and you'll understand why I'm distinguishing that in a little bit. You have to be of the same sex, and so that means that opposite sex people can't take advantage of this great institution called registered domestic partnership. On the state level, if you get it because you're married, you get it if you're a registered domestic partner. On the federal level, if you get it because you're married, forget about it if you're a registered domestic partner. Okay, so that's sort of the basic premise that you work from. But it's not marriage. Go ahead. It's not portable, meaning you can't take it from state to state. Those of you who are married know that if you decided you wanted to get married in Hawaii, how romantic, when you came back to Oregon, you were still married. And if things went sour and you ended up in Kansas, you could get divorced. No big deal. You could move from place to place. In fact, you could even move out of the country, and people knew what it was. And I'm going to disagree a little bit. I think that most people understand what marriage means now, regardless of what it meant then. Everybody sort of gets what marriage means. But there are some things that are really notable. No solemnization is necessary if you want to be registered. Wonder why that might be. And dissolution by Oregon courts, and maybe a few others, you can't go to another state and necessarily be able to undo your registration. No federal benefits. There's a lot of things that we did manage to get by getting registration. In other words, I'm not here to complain really loud about what this law did. It's a fantastic law. It's a huge step forward. You get to have dissolution procedures that are similar to divorce, and what we had before was a patchwork of case law. And if you couldn't have the presumption of equal contribution, which means you assume that when people marry, they intend to share their stuff. No attorney fees if one of them becomes more litigious. You can't say too bad attorney fees to you for being such a bad guy or gal. A lot of different things like that. And spousal support, we now have the possibility for partner support. Intestacy, which is a big deal. A lot of couples found that when they died, one or the other, they didn't get to transfer their stuff again to their partner upon death if they didn't have a will. Hospital visitation, wrongful death suit standings, right to autopsy report, and personal representative priority. That's when you do have a will, but you, or if you don't have a will and you need somebody to represent you. And then we have the Washington Domestic Partnership. Washington's current domestic partnership law, and hopefully really soon that will change, it sets out some really specific rights. So they said, these are the things you guys have been complaining about, so we're going to fix them. But it's only the stuff that people complained about really loud, basically, or that were easy, or that people wouldn't get too upset about. And then they added this thing about adding opposite-sex couples over age 62 can enter into it. This is one of those, I think, things to sort of get it over the hump. We're not really talking about gay people. So, and I'm going to go through this real quick because These are sort of the ordinary things that those of you who are married know, you get them. They're the same things now that you get in Oregon. So these are the specific things that they did say, okay, we'll let you guys have this. All right, but the breaking news. There is a bill that's been passed in both the House and the Senate, and Governor Gregoire is going to sign it, and they're going to have something that's essentially the same thing as we have, which is if you get it under state law, if you're married, you get it if you're registered. So this is just, people, it was one of the things, I think it was the one that Steve was at, we were sitting in this conference room at Lewis and Clark, huge, fairly huge room about the size of this, and there was really beginning the discussion about marriage, equality, and those sorts of things, and this very bright law student says, well, I mean, really, what do you get when you get married? And, she was very serious. And she said, I kind of married my husband, because I love him and everything. Folks don't think about what you get until you need it, and there's a bunch of them. There's a bunch of things you get. What I want to really talk about is what you don't get when you're registered. And I'm going to use a couple of experiences that I've had recently to explain that to you, and why I say that we understand what marriage is, we don't understand what domestic partnership is. I see some gray heads out there. When you were thinking about romantic relationships when you were younger, did you think about entering into a domestic partnership? Had you even heard that term? It's a brand new term. I mean, in the context historically, but we understand what marriage is. When you started thinking, those of you who entered into marriages, when you started thinking about marriage, you really did have an idea of what that was, and there was a sense of what changed about your life when you got married. And the problem with domestic partnerships is, capital D, capital P, is that people don't know what they are. Now, we, gay people, have been calling our relationships a variety of things, but over the past couple decades, the sort of common phrase was domestic partnership. I'm going to call that lowercase d, lowercase p. And that's part of the problem with, now we have domestic partnership, uppercase d, uppercase p. Are you in a domestic partnership? Are you in a domestic partnership? Or are you married? It's really kind of confusing. Now, I know there's a political reason for doing that, and it was a good political reason, and it got us where we are, but it causes a lot of confusion. The example that I want to tell you about happened just the other day. A man called me. His partner of many years was in ICU. He wanted to go in and make the decisions and visit his partner like anybody would want to do. The ICU nurse said, I'm sorry, I can't let you do that. And he wouldn't let him in, and he wouldn't let him make decisions. And he said, but I'm a registered domestic partner. And she said, that doesn't matter. You're not married. You can't go in. You can't make the decisions. Sure enough, mom comes along. She doesn't like the idea that her son is gay. And she gets to go right into the room, and she starts making end-of-life decisions. And this man can't see his partner while he's dying. He calls me up, and he says, well, I thought that we were supposed to get this right when we registered, but I guess I was wrong. And they had so thoroughly convinced him that he couldn't have this right. He was convinced that he couldn't, that this call to me was a waste of time. And I said, no, you're not wrong. You get that benefit. I got on the phone. I talked to legal at the hospital. The lawyer that I spoke to was like, oh my gosh. Actually said, oh my God. And she said, I'll take care of it. And within a half an hour, he was in there talking to the doctors, making decisions about his partner, and getting to see his partner. But the woman, the nurse wasn't trying to be mean. She just didn't understand what you got for being registered. It's very common. Women who use artificial insemination to get pregnant, if they don't adopt, the non-biological mother doesn't adopt her child, they can't leave the state, and that non-biological mom necessarily be assured that her parental rights are going to be recognized. Now, if you're registered, when you have the baby, you actually do get to have both mom's name on the birth certificate. I'm squeaking. But that birth certificate isn't enough necessarily to get your parentage recognized in another state. And there were actually a number of couples who had their names on birth certificates, and they had adopted their child and then went to less friendly states, and those states really tried not to recognize those adoptions. Unfortunately for them, they did have an adoption, and their adoptions were recognized under the full faith and credit of the U.S. Constitution. And I have to explain this daily to lesbian couples that yes, finally we get both our names on the birth certificate, and that's a great thing, and as a non-bio mom, let me tell you that's a great thing, because it's an awful thing to see an empty spot where your name should be on your birth certificate. But I want to know that when I go to Ohio, that I'm still the mom of my child. And I had to do a second parent adoption, and I'm constantly doing second parent adoptions for lots of moms. But more importantly, there's a whole lot of moms out there that I'm not reaching, or that don't hear the message, or can't afford it, frankly, who aren't getting their adoptions, and whose relationships with their child is entirely dependent on their relationship with their partner. So it's not marriage in a lot of different ways. And Oregon is one of those states where we're sort of taking a step at a time approach, and it's an important thing that we have registered domestic partnerships. But in a way, it feels like it's being used against us on some cases. I have a couple who came to me. They had registered in all the excitement, and then they did their taxes. And what they found out was that they lost $5,000, a $5,000 credit, because they had to combine their income taxes, because you have to file jointly now, which is fine, they said. You know, that's what happens to married people, but they didn't get the matching federal breaks and benefits. And they are not going to get each other's Social Security. They're not getting the whole package. And they were actually asking me about, could they divorce? They were going to dissolve that recognition, because let's face it, the income where you're eligible for that tax break, it's not a lot of money, and when you're losing $5,000, that's a lot of money. So they were seriously considering it. I still don't know what they've decided to do. So there's a lot of situations like that that are just sort of heartbreaking, and unintended consequences or unavoidable consequences of the difference between domestic partnership, civil union, I'm sure we can think of some other name other than marriage, and marriage. And that's why it's so important that we have federally recognized marriage, even if marriage is a property-oriented institution, which I absolutely agree it is. Back in my more radical days, I thought that marriage was, and I still think it is, a patriarchal institution who wants it. But what I do know is we should have the choice. We should have the choice to choose whether to enter into that and make of it what we will or not. And I have a very good friend that I have worked with over these 12 years now, where we've been sort of trying to slowly chip away at things and move hearts, minds, and political will. And he's very much beside me on this issue, has no intention of marrying, isn't registered, isn't going to marry, doesn't want it, doesn't care about the institution at all. But he wants to make sure that everybody has the choice. And that's a key thing. So federal recognition of marriage, marriage equality, when we get there, then call me up and we'll work on the problems with marriage.
Thanks, Beth. Next, we're going to have a personal story. And just from someone who's been kind of there in the trenches dealing with the issue of gay marriage, if you want to call it that. So,
my name's Rob Nose. I've lived in Oregon since 1992. I moved out here to take a job being a political activist to keep financial aid flowing and tuition low at state colleges and universities. I met my partner about that same time after being here for 4 months in 1992. He wasn't my partner at the time. His name's Jim Layden. He couldn't be here tonight. And as my career and our relationship progressed, we bought a house together in 1996. That's about the time I stopped being a professional student activist and went and got a real job. Not that that wasn't a real job, but a job at a labor union here in the state. It was in probably 1998 when Jim and I started talking about having children. And you know, when it's two men doing that, you have to be very deliberate about it. There's no accident of any kind involved, as we like to explain to our kids. And, you know, it was could we find somebody to be the surrogate mom? Should we adopt international? Could we afford to adopt a white baby? You know, I mean, all that stuff. And after exploring all the options and what we could afford, we decided to go through the state of Oregon, which actually makes it free and very easy to do, but you know, you are adopting children that have been removed from homes, often for very, very good and important reasons. You know, as we like to tell our kids, we had enough love for ourselves and our relationship with extra to spare for 2 more people. So, you know, the state of Oregon, I have to say, in 1999, 2000, really made it very easy. I don't know why. I assume there were people that pioneered before Jim and I got there to make it so, but we really didn't experience any blowback or discrimination or subtle whispers or weirdness. If that was going on for people, it was certainly happening out of sight and out of mind, and the people that we worked with were very wonderful, actually, through the whole thing. In 2000, a boy and a girl became available, and the social workers, our worker and the kids' workers, thought we would be a good match. We went down to Medford. We spent a week with them and drove home at the end of that week with our 2 children, Alazo, who was 2.5 at the time, and Alicia, who was 16 months. You know, and then in 2001, we hired an attorney so we'd have all the legal documents, what to do with our kids, be able to deal with each other's health care, property, all that stuff that Beth and the panelists were talking about. You know, we'd been together a long time at that point, and, you know, we had property, we had kids now, we felt like we were in a very committed, you know, for those of you that are parents, once you take that on, man, you feel uber responsible. I remember waking up one morning after they'd been there for a month going, oh my God, they're still here? You know, it just changed everything, you know. You know, and anyhow, you know, we were lucky that, I guess, financially we were in a spot where we could afford an attorney and put all the legal documents together. We knew people who were very supportive. Our friends were very supportive. You know, basically we were middle class enough to be able to take advantage of some of the legal things that we could put in place to make sure our kids and our family had protection. Though I still wonder, even the story about, you were saying just about OHSU, you know, I feel like I know where those documents are. If I had to find them, I worry about what would happen. So, okay, in 2003, we decided to get married. We went to Canada. And I'll tell a little funny vignette. Those of you might remember when Bush got elected, they passed a bunch of tax cuts right around that time in 2003. And because we weren't legally married, somehow we got extra money, extra checks. I don't fully understand how it worked, but it was a benefit to us to not actually be in a legally sanctioned marriage. And so we took the money from the tax cut that we got. We bought rings, paid for tickets to Canada, paid for the marriage license. Bush paid for it. In fact, we sent the White House a letter with our photo, a copy of our marriage certificate, a copy of the checks that were provided to us. And do you think we got any acknowledgement? It was really, I thought they wrote back to everybody that writes them. But anyhow. And I guess, you know, we did it because we loved each other. We wanted the sanction. We were kind of caught up in the cool. I've been a political activist all my life. It felt like an activist gesture and a loving gesture at the same time. But, you know, I'm looking around the audience, so most of you are, you know, I'm not sure if this little movie vignette will make sense to you, but there's a movie when I was growing up that I liked a lot called The Breakfast Club, and the geeky character in the movie, Anthony Michael Hall, when he was asked about his girlfriend, had to say, oh yeah, she's in Niagara Falls, and the movie takes place in Chicago. And it feels like whenever I say, yeah, I'm married in Canada, it sort of feels like that, you know? It's like, it doesn't seem like it's, I'm married in Canada, like it's not a real marriage. I don't know. So that, you know, that has kind of been I guess our journey through this. And I guess as I think about our family and, you know, the course that my life has taken, I really do hope that, you know, all the things will come in place to make it possible so that I don't have to worry about this stuff, so that my kids know that our relationship is real, that we're their real parents, that there's no repercussions for it or anything like that. We've been very lucky, I think, to live in Portland and Southeast and go to a school that's very affirming, and surprisingly, none of their friends or any of their friends' parents have ever really teased them about this, which amazes me to this day. But anyhow, I just, you know, that's something I worry about quite a bit. You know, we're a very good family. We put a lot of effort and energy into our relationship and our children, and I just want to be able to have that affirmed, I think, the responsibility and the commitment that we made. In my spare time when I'm not at work, I'm on the Basic Rights Oregon Political Action Committee, which helps to get candidates elected who support the kind of laws that we were able to get passed in this state in 2007. And I wasn't part of the board that helped elect people that got the law passed, but I did help try to protect and defend those that supported us in getting that law. And I'm very proud of that work that I'm doing with Bro to help set the stage. You know, this was a good first step. I think it's been pointed out by Beth Allen and other people. But like she said, it's not marriage. And I'm excited about the chance to try to make that happen. I think the people that are sort of doing the work on this on a day-to-day basis believe that a lot of education and work is going to have to get done in our state, because unlike these other places, Iowa and Vermont, it doesn't seem that we can rely on the legislature or the courts, because we have to overturn a ballot measure in the state. When Measure 36 passed, that put it into our Constitution. I think I'm right about this. I'll defer to the lawyer if I'm wrong. And so we're stuck, I think, running a ballot measure campaign in this state to be able to make my relationship legal in the United States, not just in Canada.
Thanks, Rob. Although I'm sure you were disappointed that you didn't get a letter back from the Bush administration. I think you can rest that you were at least noted, and your name is probably in a file somewhere that will still to be uncovered. Okay. Our third panelist is going to be Rev Tara Wilkins. She's the Executive Director of the Community of Welcoming Congregations, and she is going to be talking about just about some religious traditions and what is common within religious traditions about those that do and do not sanction same-sex marriages and some of the religious issues that are related to this issue.
My comments are not meant to be exhaustive, because we could be here all afternoon talking about things like the intersection of religion and politics, the role of religion in marriage. There are a lot of topics that we could spend a great deal of time on. But I do want to sort of highlight some of the questions that arise out of this whole question of marriage equality. First, I'd like to say that the Community of Welcoming Congregations is an interfaith network of religious and spiritual communities that have all adopted a position to be welcome and affirming. So we work for the full inclusion and equality for those who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. That means that we do education work around public policy. We do a lot of work within congregations to help them to be welcoming places, and we do a lot of pastoral care and support for the GLBT community. And Congregation Neve Shalom, we'll hear from Rabbi Isaac in a few minutes, it was one of our founding congregations. We have 103 members of more than 20 religious traditions and denominations throughout the state. In 2004, I changed my mind on why marriage equality is important. I think up until that time, I thought it was important, but I didn't necessarily think it was the issue. I was more concerned with issue of non-discrimination, of not being able to be ruled out of housing because you're gay, and lots of other things. But in 2004, when Multnomah County began to issue marriage licenses, we were asked by Basic Rights Oregon to provide some clergy who would officiate for couples who wished to come down and officiate for their brief ceremony. We had holy but very brief ceremonies as people lined up to get married. And it was in those experiences, I think I officiated for over 100 couples in 7 weeks when that window was open. And that experience changed my life. That watching couples come down who had been together, who had paid off mortgages, who raised kids together, who had been together for 17 and 20 and 30 years to come down to have their marriage sanctioned, moved me deeply in the experiences of these couples. And normally, when I officiate for a heterosexual wedding, I don't talk about the power vested in me by the state of Oregon. That little statement, I don't include that in our ceremony. But for those weddings, I very much did. And it was those words that were both very powerful to the couples, but that raised a lot of questions, because I realized in those moments that we were acting on behalf of the state, that we became somehow an arm of the state when we signed those marriage licenses saying that these couples' ceremonies are sanctioned. And there were all kinds of sort of issues that come out of that idea. Who could come? One of the powerful witnesses of that time was down at the Keller Auditorium. We had different stations. So Rabbi Joey Wolf was there next to us, and you'd have a rabbi and a Unitarian and a United Church of Christ person all lined up together, all these different traditions. It was really a special time. But there were questions about who couldn't be there. Because some of our religious traditions, it is against their religious law to officiate for a same-gender wedding. So some of our Presbyterian and Methodist and Lutheran colleagues came down to be supportive, but they couldn't sign the marriage license because for fear that there would be questions, and they could actually lose their ministerial credentials by officiating for a same-gender service. Well, during that time, it seemed to be all about love, but it was also political in nature. And as time went on, we have begun to talk with people across the country about the various challenges of being a pastor with various different denominational rules. So there are traditions like Bonnie Tinker's going to talk. She's Quaker. The Quakers have been instrumental across the country in helping marriage equality to happen. The Unitarian Universalists have been instrumental. United Church of Christ. Most denominations of Judaism are supportive, but many traditions are very much divided. And so what happens in a state like in California, when marriage was legal, pastors now have a problem, because their religious tradition doesn't allow for them to provide the religious ceremony of their congregants, who now can legally get married. And, you know, there's an intense injustice in that religiously, because religiously they are prohibited to do what is now legally sanctioned. So our justice movement is really twofold, because we need to work on helping to change the religious law of various traditions that present this difficult situation, while at the same time advocating politically to ensure that we have marriage equality. Now, this movement has brought about all kinds of creative ways that we can take a position to help this effort to happen, and one of which is there's a growing number of clergy throughout the country, including a small group in Ashland, that have refused to sign any marriage licenses until it is legal for all of us to be married. And our feeling with CWC is that we need to really hit home, why not marriage? You know, I think it's a ploy to say, well, you can have your rights, but just call it something else. For us, I'm more married to my wife of 10 years than I ever was to my children's father. That marriage is something that we get to define for ourselves and our religious communities, and in terms of what is right for us. And so we are working hard to advocate for having that conversation that up until very recently, religious communities have been very reluctant to have. Why, let's just not, why do you have to have the word? It's interesting when you talk about historically with marriage, because the nuclear family, as we think of it, the mom and dad and 2.5 kids, really doesn't exist in ancient times in the same way. We didn't organize ourselves that way. And so when I hear Dr. Dobson, who's not even a biblical scholar, but he's a psychologist, talk about how God ordained forevermore and always this one way of organizing ourselves, it's just not true. It's just not true. In the same way that, many religious people will say, well, people of faith only support this traditional definition of marriage. There are many religious leaders throughout the state that are extremely supportive of full marriage equality, no exceptions, no equivocations. And so we mean to have the conversation. There's a growing number of people who really feel that there should be this separation between civil marriage and religious marriage, and that we should all have civil equality, and then religious communities are free to do whatever the rules of their tradition say. And that's a strong position. But I would advocate for still calling it marriage. Marriage is marriage, and we did our taxes this year, and it was a tax nightmare. And I thought, well, this is cool because at least in this one little spot we'll get to be married, until I realized that we had to do 4 different tax forms, and we lost money that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And I thought, wow, this is not enough. We get calls all the time, like the call that you got from the hospital, often a social worker or a distraught partner who says that the medical team will not let me in, and often the family has something to do with that sort of intimidation. And my comment is, hang up the phone and go back to the hospital. And I've offered to go with them if that would help, because there's still this very divided understanding of what this really means in terms of whose relationships are most valid or most important. And so we have adopted, along with transgender education, which brings up a whole other issue that we won't cover today, that marriage equality is one of our program priorities over these next couple years, because as different states are adopting different policies and we're figuring out what to do in Oregon, nothing happens in the religious community quickly. It's a slow process, and so we figure that it's better to begin to have the conversation now of advocating for full marriage equality. And events like this are very important because, I'm sure that you all are all across the spectrum in terms of whether you're religious or anti-religious or lukewarm religious or whatever, but it's a knowledge that you should have so that we can be able to talk about these issues intelligently and in an informed way. One of the most powerful things that we saw was in 2005, when we were advocating for the then Senate Bill 1000. And we had many clergy go down and testify in support. And there was a young gay man who met me in the back of the room, and he was crying, and he said, that's the first time I had ever heard a positive religious message. And I always tell people the irony is he had to go to Salem to get it, but but the important witness of that is that one wing, if you will, of one tradition gets an awful lot of airtime. And we are the most religiously diverse country in the world. But one wing, and Rita Brock says that's okay, they may be the one wing, but we're the rest of the bird. But progressives have to come out as people of faith and let people know that. Otherwise, that one wing gets to play what we call the God card right? As if God is on their side and everybody else's expression of what it means to be spiritual or what it means to be religious just isn't the same thing. So I would say speak out and speak up out and often, and to come out as people of faith and remind people that there is a growing movement of religious folks that are fully supportive of GLBT inclusion.